I had them change this for you guys. Is this a little easier to deal with? So now we shift to how they start developing some sort of policy for drugs here. And it was not an easy path, and it took a while. So we know drugs have been around forever. As soon as people climbed out of the mud and stood upright, they started consuming things that would, what we would say, would alter their constitution. Sometimes it was done, obviously, for all kinds of rituals that are out there, which are still practiced even through today. Anybody working in corrections? No? One of the things that sometimes kind of catches people by surprise is there are certain drugs that Native American tribes will use as part of certain type of rituals, and since those are a recognized faith, they must be allowed even in prison. So it's kind of like, what do you mean they get to do drugs? Yeah. Well, they have a whole process they have to go through. It's not something they can state by the power vested in me what they're doing. But anyway, I'd love to know who was the first dude to chew on the bark of a tree, because he came up with one of the most important drugs in the history of mankind, and that is quinine. Quinine is used for malaria, which has probably killed more people worldwide throughout history than any other ailment that is out there. And it comes from the bark of a tree. So how did they figure this out? Something I did. Okay. And other stuff. I know every single one of you in here has probably used salicylic acid. I'm sorry?
Salicylic acid
for
acne.
You can use it for acne, absolutely, but it's used far more commonly for a host of other things. It's aspirin. That's the chemical name for aspirin. Okay. Plenty of others out there. A common heart drug, digoxin, comes from a plant. Many of our drugs come from plants and natural things. Okay. So healthcare, yeah, they also, back in the day, they were of the opinion that people who had headaches had the devil inside their head. The demon was inside their head, so you had to get the demon out of the head. And one of the ways they did this was through a lovely procedure that's still used today called trepanning. Now, modern uses very fancy, sophisticated equipment. Back then, they found basically a stone and kind of sharpened it, stuck it in the side of the skull, and then used this rotating thing to poke a hole in the skull. We have found numerous skulls in ancient burial sites that had this nicely ground hole in their head, and that's, to release the demons that might be in their head causing bad things. Of course, hole in their head was kind of a bad thing, but we've used drugs to celebrate. We use drugs for recreation. All of these have been in play since there was such a thing as a drug, regardless of how they found it. And of course, it all continues today. Obviously, we've bounced all over the place between people thinking drugs are wonderful, great, and terrific, and drugs are the, devil's own type of thing. And we always seem to be kind of half and half in that. And sometimes it depends on the drug, sometimes it doesn't, but it's never been 100% drugs are great, 100% drugs are bad. So a lot of times this idea of putting drugs as a don't take bad thing, because someone thinks they're really bad. When you look at the original legislation, this came up in my night class. Why is marijuana Schedule 1? As part of your first assignment is going through those schedules. And Schedule 1 is the most serious and the most serious time, and it's really bad, and it's going to kill you, and yada, 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 yada. And marijuana's in it. Yeah. And it's like, huh? Well, that's because the devil's lettuce. Back in the day, you look at some of those early commercials, one of their favorite ones was to take a human brain and fry it in a frying pan and say, this was your brain on marijuana. There are two men. I've followed them since I found out about it. One just died, Alabama and Georgia. They received death sentences for possession of marijuana. Now, we're not talking an ounce here, okay, this wasn't personal use, but at the same time, it's not like they were having a plane load full. I think maybe a pound, somewhere around there. I wasn't able to get the original records on it. Anyway, so they were sentenced to death. One was in 63, the other was in 65, because both states had the death penalty for possession for sale, or possession with intent to distribute. That's kind of a different name you'll see. And thanks to Furman in 1972, their death sentences, of course, were commuted, but it became life without the possibility of parole. And there they have sat for 80 years. You know, there's no point in releasing them at this point. I don't think either one of them would have wanted to be. I mean, talk about institutionalized after that period of time. But the one is still in prison for pot that he was probably sharing with his neighbors or friends. Okay. Gee, has the policy and the mindset changed towards pot?
Yeah.
Okay. Even when I was working patrol, I can remember the exact day they gave us the new law where we can only write an infraction. So we all had to learn the new codes and the new sections and how much constituted, you know, the infraction value versus a misdemeanor value and so on and so forth. And it's just going down, and it's probably going to continue because we have some areas where it's legalized, some areas where it's decriminalized, other areas where it's still totally illegal. And part of that is a problem because part is federal, which of course applies everywhere. And then some states have made the changes to decriminalize or legalize. So there's a constant conflict that has not yet been settled. So how people classify drugs, let me give you another one. Racial and ethnic. Anyone know what drug we're talking about here?
Racial and ethnic?
Yeah. The different penalties were based on racial and ethnic.
Cocaine.
Yes, absolutely. Cocaine. Powdered cocaine was seen, the elites, meaning whites.
Yeah, like the billionaires.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then only thugs
Only, yeah.
took crack,
Yeah.
which meant generally the black,
Yeah.
but a little bit
The
of the
black
Hispanic
ones.
population. So we need to do 20 years for possession of crack and a month for possession of powder cocaine. It's virtually the same drug. Okay, so just whoever happens to be in power, whoever happens to be the most afraid of whatever it was that they were trying to regulate, and you get marijuana in Schedule 1, and then you get the sentence disparities between crack and powder cocaine, even though it's both listed as the same drug. Now, one thing wars are good for, it's not the only thing, is a lot of medical advances happen during war because they have to. As medical professionals at the front lines try and deal with the overwhelming injuries that are a part of war. There was no such thing as anesthesia for the longest time, so when you got that lead bullet, and that's what they were just brown chunks of lead, into your body, they were aware that it caused massive issues. They didn't know what lead poisoning was yet, but they did know it would cause gangrene, all kinds of issues. Anyways, so the leg had to be cut off, or the arm, or whatever it was. Well, grab a saw and start cutting. Give the guy something to hold in his teeth, usually a piece of wood. 6 or 8 people to hold him down. They might give him a lot of booze if they had it available, but on the front lines, that was in short supply. And start sawing away. So it was even odds whether they dropped dead from this incredible, fun amputation or the lead ball. Eventually, they would develop chloroform, which was a huge leap forward in lessening pain sensation, but when you're chopping off somebody's leg, plus it has its own issues. Booze, of course, is absolutely useless as far as pain relief is concerned. You can get somebody so drunk that they're barely alive, and they're going to know when you cut their leg off. This is why they had a hard time operating on anything within the thoracic or abdominal cavities,
because you're going to open that up while the person's still awake and alive. That's not a good thing. There's not enough people holding down. So they made advances on how to keep people sedated. There was a guy by the name of, I think his first name was Alfred, but anyways, last name Lister. You might connect him to Listerine, which he actually isn't connected to. But Mr. Lister had figured out that bad demons, so to speak, were not causing infections. Dirty instruments, dirty medical professionals. I kid you not, there are plenty of pictures, not pictures, the drawings, where surgical instruments were dipped in a bucket of bloody water before they moved on to the next patient. That was their idea of cleaning the instruments. So Lister was the one who said there was this thing called soap, and maybe we needed to wash these things, keep the patient clean, so on and so forth. So he is credited with the idea of trying to keep medical stuff clean. And of course, once doctors started realizing their infection levels went way down, the idea catches on and explodes. Another one, if you watch MASH, because they brought this up, a young man got shot in the leg badly. I mean, the leg's all just blown to hell. They can't save a big part of the femoral artery. Well, without it, you ain't going to be able to keep the leg. That's all there is to it. It's the main blood supply to the lower part of the leg. But it's not like they can fix it. It's blown apart. And you can't take it from somewhere else in the guy because, he sort of needs it there. Well, they got a patient that's dying. His head's been blown off. He's still alive. He's not dead yet. And the whole episode is about waiting for the guy to pass so they can take a piece of his femoral artery and transplant it into the new one. That's exactly how it was found, although it wasn't during MASH, during Korea. It was found during Vietnam. Doing CPR was found in the field. So wars do produce one thing. Okay, I don't know that I'd want to have a war just to have medical advances, but we do, and we can point this all the way back to Roman armies, where they learned that sugar is a great wound healer, helps prevent infection. We use that to this day. Sugar, honey, honey is probably one of the best, and of course they had plenty of honey back then. But bacteria can't grow in honey. They don't know why it works, they just knew it did. Penicillin. Well, we didn't have penicillin. That's a relatively new invention. What did they have prior? Moldy bread. That's actually how they invented penicillin. Was through mold on bread, because they had no preservatives back then, so bread would go bad very, very quickly. And somebody figured out, you gotta love these guys trying all this weird crap. You put a piece of moldy bread on a wound, it doesn't get infected. They didn't know why. They did not know why, but it worked, so you did it. That was a common thing. Soldiers today are taught about the sugar in the honey. It's a great wound dressing in the field because it works. It doesn't allow bacteria to grow. All right? So all of this, things start changing. So medical science is kind of having this huge surge. And then they find morphine. And remember, when you process the poppies, you get opium paste. When that is processed, it becomes morphine. And then it has to be processed again before we get heroin. So they find out about morphine and find out about its absolutely terrific, fantastic pain-relieving properties. Okay, drug of choice, absolute drug of choice. And it had been used by the Chinese who would eat the poppies. They also ate them for recreation too. But they were given to patients for pain relief. So they'd known about this. Took us a little longer to figure it out. Then they invent the syringe, because orally was pretty much the only way you could get a drug into a person at this point, which any of us know. You take that Tylenol for that headache or muscle ache or whatever, and you sit there and you wait for this stuff to actually take effect, okay, where obviously you get instantaneous effect if it's injected. Now, keep in mind, the needles and syringes we have now are not those. that was a very large piece of metal that somebody bored a hole in the center of it and kind of pounded it in. It's very large. You go to any museum that has health stuff, see if you can find one of the original syringes. It'll give you the creeps. But that's what they had. It was a monstrous advance because now we can get the drug into the patient knowing exactly what it's going to do and how fast it's going to do. Seconds. Okay, so that's an awesome one. So they start with this morphine during the Civil War when they're blowing each other's legs and arms and other body parts off. Very useful. Very, very useful. And something starts going wrong and they're not quite sure, again, what's happening. It's addiction, but they don't know what that is yet. They just called it the soldier's disease.
Oh.
Because they didn't know what it was. They were getting very, very dependent. I think, oh God, television series that was set during this time. Little House on the Prairie. Little House on the Prairie. They actually have an episode on that where a kid is addicted to morphine. And he starts stealing from the doctor there and whatnot. Okay? But the whole town's kind of like, he's addicted to what? Huh? What's addiction? Huh? They have no clue. They have no clue what's going on. And even the doctor in the thing it has to call colleagues to figure out what's happening. Because he hasn't had any dealings with it. It was also a common treatment for what they called women's troubles.
Like periods and stuff?
Period is one big part of it, but also what they called feminine hysterics, which, yeah, PMS, or just, females having an attitude for any reason, and females weren't allowed to have attitudes back then.
Oh, yeah.
So you put the female in the nearest convent. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of the convents on the prairie. So give them some of this and let them just kind of float their way out the door.
Okay.
I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. But obviously they could get addicted to it. Then the Brits made a liquid form of it and still use it. It's outlawed in the United States. It's called laudanum, and it actually has a very high sugar content. And unfortunately, animals will lap it up. So of course they're freaking loaded to the gills or overdose. People will overdose on it very easily because of the no longer bitter taste. It actually kind of has a sweet taste, but they still have it over there. We don't have it here. The only liquid form of anything along these lines that we have is in cough syrups. It's still present in many cough syrups. Okay. But yeah, soldier's disease. I love that. Of course, cocaine's making their way over here. Farmers had learned a long time ago that if they needed to work longer hours, mainly during harvesting season where it's from sun up to sundown, they would chew on the coca leaves, get a little bit of a high that keeps them going, and they could keep working. Okay, so they were always seen as chewing either on the little nut seeds that they had or on the leaves themselves. One of your assignments deals with Vin Mariani and the idea of putting cocaine in wine and Coca-Cola. The original Coca-Cola had quite a bit of cocaine in it, mainly because anything that was marketed for health very commonly had cocaine in it. It was seen as the wonder drug. Babies are having problems, they're teething. Here's the stuff you can put on there. You're having stomach troubles. Here's this stomach tonic. Got cocaine in it. Cocaine was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. The absolute wonder drug. They didn't see any problems with this. They put it in everything. And of course, since there's no regulation, nobody knows even what they're taking here. And like I said, the original Coca-Cola formula had quite a bit of cocaine. Now, does it still have it? Yes, it still does. Through an agreement when it was outlawed, Coca-Cola made a pervasive argument through the courts that this was their formula. It was patented. They needed to keep some in there. But knowing obviously that cocaine and having large quantities in their drink wasn't a good idea, they would take it down to a almost molecular level. But it would allow them to continue to say their formula was the same with the cocaine as it had ever been from first manufacturing, which is why it's under a vault. Their recipe is still locked away in a vault. There's only 2 people in the world that have the access to that vault.
So there's still cocaine?
There is still cocaine in every single Coca-Cola you have.
Really?
That is 100% true.
Y'all-
I will swear
y'all ain't
on
concerned
any
about
religious
that?
book you care to put in front of me, it is 100%. Yeah.
Because the way I drive down a Coca-Cola should be ashamed.
You might be drinking too much cocaine there. You need to be careful. We'll do a cocaine test on you, and ooh, she's gonna come back positive.
Oh, Lord, that's scary.
Girl, there are a lot of foods that will show up positive on drug tests.
Poppy seeds.
Poppy seeds is number 1 that will show
I don't know
positive for
about that
cocaine.
one.
But lemon seeds is another one. There's others. You'll throw a positive test. So if you're a big one for bagels with everything and Coke, don't go take a drug test.
She said everything in Coke.
Yeah, you're gonna be walking that police department with a drug test, and you're gonna end up in jail. Go ahead.
So you said there's 2 people that like.
Only 2 people in the world have the access to that vault combination.
So what happens if like one of them dies? Like.
I have no idea. I imagine they have some sort of internal practice to
Some backup
yeah,
plan, yeah.
replacement or something.
That's crazy.
So you know flour canisters and sugar canisters, like they'll have that ingredient for candy.
Mm-hmm.
You find a lot of antique ones that say cocaine because people just have like cocaine canisters. Just
Absolutely.
Oh.
It was that common. It was seen as the wonder drug.
Get mad about
Whatever
weed.
ailed you
But the
could
whole
be
world's on
fixed by
cocaine.
cocaine.
Y'all
It
mad
wasn't
about
seen as this and
weed.
getting high.
Y'all mad
It was
about
seen as
weed,
something
but
that was
the whole world
beneficial.
was on cocaine.
Remember when they marketed cigarettes?
Times
Okay,
was
if you look at the
crazy.
old ads for cigarettes, especially for women, this was how to look sophisticated and cool. Demure. Yeah, to use that modern ugly term. Oh my God. Okay, the Marlboro Man. So if you were manly, you had a cigarette draping out of your mouth. Okay. Attitudes change obviously over time, but this was one of the ones that was real popular for chest colds. And here's where it has a use, because again, as I said, cocaine can still be found along with opium in some medicinal things. Chest colds, heroin, morphine is used to suppress the cough reflex, especially in children with whooping cough, because it can get to the point where they can actually tear lung tissue because they're coughing so hard. So they need to shut it down a little bit, and that's what the opium type drugs are for. Cocaine can be used as what they call an expectorant. If a person has got a lot of mucus in their lungs, makes it harder and harder for them to breathe, they need to get it out. Well, an expectorant helps them cough it out. Okay, so that's where you see this stuff. Still out there, still in there. So here's one of the first companies that marketed cocaine. And it didn't hurt that Sigmund Freud said this stuff was the greatest stuff since sliced bread. Okay? It wasn't until a colleague died that Freud changed his mind.
I bet
But
he did.
he kept saying it was just the greatest thing, and of course he was seen as this, wonderful person with all these new, wonderful, great, terrific theories. So people kind of ate it up with a spoon, literally. And overall, the attitude by Americans just was, let people do what they want. They want to eat this stuff, knock yourself out. We don't care. We really don't. So it allowed it to proliferate pretty much every aspect of life. Need to work a few more hours? Drink some of this. Broke a bone, you still need to work? We'll take a little bit of this and let you keep working. And so, bad things happen, too bad, so sad. So overall, the reason we really didn't go anywhere as far as trying to regulate any of this, first of all, we didn't have any agencies that dealt with the medical field or the veterinary field, either one. You wanted to call yourself a doctor by the power vested in me, I am now an MD. Let me fix you. Your cow sick, I can fix it. Now I'm a vet. Okay? This was worldwide. People could claim to be a medical professional without anything backing them up, and people kind of went, okay. Pharmacists were licensed. They just read more about all the little potions and powders that were out there.
Okay.
Right? Which is to this day the same. Do not ask your doctor about drugs. I want to prescribe you this, fine. Ask your pharmacist. They're the ones that can tell you what's good, what's bad. Oh, you're already taking this, you shouldn't be taking that, and so on. For example, there are a lot of drugs you cannot take with grapefruit juice or grapefruits. A lot of them. Doctors go, yeah, that's right. So which ones? I don't know. Go ask your pharmacist. That's their job. That's their work. They know that stuff inside out, backwards, and if you got a good doctor, he will tell you need to ask the pharmacist. He can tell you more than I can. Or if they're good enough, they'll actually pull out one of those PDRs and look it up right there in front of you. Because every pharmacist has one. It's physician's desk reference. Comes out every year with all the new drugs, interactions, side effects, yada, yada, yada. Very few doctors will admit they don't know. They may have a copy of it, but they won't look at it, especially in front of a patient. So ask your pharmacist. But back then, anybody could. There was a guy in England, he actually was running around Scotland, acting as a vet. And everyone thought he had some sort of academics behind him because he had a bunch of letters past his name, until somebody figured out what those letters meant. Member of the Kennel Club. That's what the letters were. Had nothing to do with any kind of academic attainment. Okay? But people get impressed by letters. They really do. So they put a bunch of letters past their name, and all of a sudden, you're brilliant. Plus, we have this whole thing, what we were founded on is this whole idea that we're republic. Much as everyone keeps calling our democracy, we're not. We're a republic. We have a federal government, yes, but the states are left to regulate themselves. And in the early years, this was adamant. Feds need to just go stay in Washington and shut their mouths. States can do what they needed to do when they needed to do it and how they needed to do it. And they wanted to keep it that way. So if there was going to be any regulations on drug laws, it had to come at the state level, which for the most part didn't exist. So eventually, states weren't doing it, feds stepped in. First part, those medicines that everyone's handing out at every gathering, church, school, whatever, they were known as patent medicines. They were to the point where they're claiming to cure every disease known to man and good for dog and beast and human. Man, dog, and beast. You'd see that on the label. Good for man, dog, and beast.
Okay.
I don't know. I thought dog was part of the whole beast thing, but okay, whatever. And there were minority groups, and primarily what we're talking about here is the Irish and Chinese. Irish and Chinese, depending on which coast you were on, that had their own practices. And for the Chinese in particular, they smoked opium. They had opium dens. That's where that term came from, where they would gather. It's a social thing where they would gather. And if you're familiar with a hookah, that's what they're using there. And it's just kind of a gathering of friends and family and conversation and so on and so forth. Okay, so, but it was seen as a bad thing. And the whole point is these patent medicines, God knows what was in them. And a common ingredient, God help us, was arsenic. That dates from the Victorian era, where a beautiful woman was and when I say white, I mean actually physically as white as she possibly could be. Well, arsenic lightens the skin tone. Never mind the fact that it's deadly as hell, but that's okay. You're going to be pretty in your grave because you're as light as they possibly could. So arsenic was seen as a good thing. Oh, well, let's just add it to our patent medicines. Maybe it'll do something good. Might kill them off, I guess, but, I don't know any of this stuff. All they know is, let's just add it. And, oh, gee, the very first ingredient very often was alcohol. As you see, as we'll go through some of these things, you put alcohol with a lot of these, alcohol has this effect, opium has this effect, but when you put them together, the combined effect is not just 1 + 1, it's 5 + 5. And that's called potentiation. Very, very common. So people are overdosing, people are dropping dead. They're giving this to babies, arsenic, alcohol, and okay. And none of this is known exactly what's in it, because nobody requires it. So the government says no. So our first one is the Pure Food and Drug Act. Packaged foods, which were few and far between, canned goods mainly, but drugs, any medicines, had to list, nothing's illegal here, guys. This had nothing to do with making stuff illegal. You had to list the ingredients. So if you're marketing this stuff as fill in the blank, whatever it is, stomach powder, well, here's what's in it. And it had to be on the front label. They had to be able to see it, just pick up the bottle and look at it. If you ever are wandering around any place, garage sale or something, and you see one of these bottles, they're seriously worth money. They're usually colored. It has kind of an oval shape down at the bottom. The shoulders come into a narrow neck and then kind of a wide top with a lip. They are worth serious bucks. Serious bucks. Some of them have gone as high as $20,000 and $30,000 for one bottle. People have no idea what they are. They just see a colored bottle and they think it's just colored glass, and there it goes in the garage sale after grandma dies. Okay, and those might be medicine bottles dating from this time. Serious money. Okay, almost any pharmacy, really good sized pharmacy, will have some of them on display. They'll get their hands on some and keep them in there as a display thing. So they got to identify stuff. They're allowed to use all of this stuff still. They just have to identify it. So that was their idea behind the term purity, was to kind of be upfront to people as to what they were taking. Okay. Now, one thing right off the get-go, the South was not happy about this. South is kind of the opinion they get to do whatever they want and don't have federal government, you know, that whole Civil War thing. Yeah. South isn't real good about being told by the federal government to do anything. So there was a lot of pushback. Unfortunately for the South, Fed said, too bad, so sad. Oh, shut up. How does it not know we're using it? Anyways. I'm gonna shoot. Well, I'm shoot the damn thing. They had to deal with it. Okay. Just to give you an idea how bad Texas is, you guys wouldn't know this because it was before your time, but when they started doing the whole drunk driving thing and put the drunk driving at 0.10 was the first regulation. Nationwide. Okay. Everybody's on board. We have a 0.10. There was nothing said about anything else. So Texas had put the 0.10 in, but they still allowed open container. You could still drink and drive as long as you weren't over the 10. I remember the first time I visited my sister out here, and she picks me up at the airport, opens the trunk, hands me a beer, and I'm like, huh? She goes, yeah, it's legal here. And I'm like, ooh, this is a great state. I like this. And off we went and drove to her house. Anyways, well, of course, it changed to 0.08, correct? Mm-hmm. Texas went, F you. We ain't changing it. We're perfectly happy with the 0.10. We're not changing it. So the feds go, okay, all right, we can't force you to change it. You know, you're sovereign and all that. Oh, and by the way, that $7.5 billion we hand you in highway funds, we can't do that if you're not in compliance. Bye. Took less than 30 days. And all of a sudden, Texas was 0.08, no more open container law, no more okay to drink and drive law. That all went out the door at the same time. Okay. But that was kind of common because states, and it wasn't just the South, other states argued as well. But one of the biggest arguments was to go from 0.10 to 0.08 was the rest of the world, like all of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, it's 0.05. We only go 0.05 for juveniles. And that's 18 to 21. Under 18, still 0. But between 18 and 21, it's 0.05. Well, the rest of the world, that's 0.05 for everybody. Which for most people, that doesn't mean basically one drink. And you're done. You're absolutely done. Okay? So everybody kind of backed off and lived with the 0.08. But we really hadn't said anything about legality yet. And that would take the Harrison Act. Not that long after. It's only 8 years after. But they realized that while we got this great labeling system going, maybe we need to make people a little more aware of some of the potential problems and what they're actually taking. So, it's not yet illegal, okay? This is about making money off of it. So, they thought they could control the use of drugs through taxing. So, anybody basically having anything to do with drugs, and specifically opiate and cocaine only, they weren't worried about the others yet. They had to register with the Treasury Department, kind of like your driver's license type thing, pay the tax, and keep records of every transaction. So if I sold him this, write down who he sold it to, how much he sold it to. It wasn't about the money or anything else, just keeping a record. So if we have a person that's bought something enough for 500 people, you know we have a potential problem. Okay? So that started it, but it didn't make drugs illegal. Okay? It's just about getting trapped. And doctors said, well, we're not prescribing anything anymore, because that's what you did. You walked into a doctor's office, I want some cocaine, here's your script, off you went. Couldn't do that anymore, because now the physician's going, I'm not going through that process. I'm not paying attention to this. I'm not paying the tax. Go get it on your own. Well, they did. And that's the beginning of the black market. Because people still wanted it. Needless to say, there was plenty of people dependent, if not addicted to these drugs. So they're still going to get it. It's just we shift from a public market to a black market. Now another big one, it took a little longer, 20 years later. This was about marijuana. And they were the ones who brought marijuana as a more recreational drug into the country, because in their hometowns, it was seen as, kind of like the opium dens. You sat in a group, smoke a little weed, have a conversation. Not a bad thing. More of a group-friendly thing. Okay? Well, we had established what would become the forerunner to the DEA, and that's the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And here we go with the crazy advertisements. Right off the get-go. Because these were not native-born Americans, they could kind of leap into this cesspool. This is kind of one of the phrases they use. That's why that's up there. Responsible for murder. They're all crazy. They all sleep with anything and everything that moves thanks to this killer weed. So we need to slam it down hard, fast. Mainly because we're targeting Hispanic immigrants. So they could use this kind of incredibly inflammatory descriptions because they were targeting a population that had no way really at that time of fighting back and had a lot of support from the white population. Okay. So what they did, start with the tax. They did make it illegal. Okay, first about the money, get the money. So every time it was sold, now look at this. The seller had to pay $100 per ounce for that tax stamp to make it legal. $100 an ounce. Now look at 1937. Yearly salaries were between $1,200 and $1,500 a year for the average worker. Yeah. So while they didn't officially make it illegal, obviously, here we go again, driving it profoundly underground, and it was a federal offense. Okay. We wouldn't technically make it illegal till the Controlled Substance Act in 1970. But this was kind of did it anyways, because who could afford it? Even now, a tax of $100 an ounce? Yeah, good luck. Back then, that you might as well made it $1 million an ounce for their ability to pay it. Now, on the alcohol side, this one was a little earlier start to it. The demon rum. Alcohol could be made relatively cheaply if one had fruit, bread, or honey. Very first alcohol was made from honey. That was mead, kind of a weird beer. Prisoners make it with any piece of fruit and one molecule of yeast. That's all they need, and they can make their own what they call hooch. That's some potent stuff too. I wouldn't drink it unless you're drunk, because oh my God, it's worse than moonshine. But anyways, the temperance movement was people, primarily elite women, primarily, that saw people who drank as a scourge amongst society. They weren't productive. They were lousy husbands if they were married, lousy fathers if they had children, just served no purpose in society because everything they were and did revolved around the alcohol. And in some ways they weren't wrong because drinking had become monstrously big during this time frame. So their idea was to eliminate alcohol, of course, altogether. That was their goal, was to eliminate alcohol altogether. And while there were many that agreed they needed to do something about the drunks, but they weren't on board 100% yet. And this whole idea of eliminating alcohol altogether, no, okay, but we're seeing it as a problem. Churches are preaching against it, regardless of the denomination. They were all saying it's immoral and you're just subversive, which is kind of an interesting way of describing them, but that's the term that they were using. So it's gaining power. This temperance movement is starting to gain some steam here. Took a while, like I said, this is kind of a slow roll, but we actually had a formal organization, the WCTU, and they would, now women did not walk into places that served alcohol unless you were of a certain persuasion. And these women would walk into a saloon and kind of create chaos, as in dump out all the alcohol they could get their hands on, berate the men. They really didn't say anything to the prostitutes. They didn't care. Most prostitutes weren't that drunk anyways. They wanted the guys drunk because then they'd spend more money. But they got a lot of attention. They basically said the entire world's problems can be traced to one thing and one thing only, and that is the consumption of alcohol. And that's where we got that term demon rum. Okay? For the most part, these people that leaped on this wagon, what they would be called prohibitionists, were Protestants, white, and rural. In the cities, while it was still white Protestants, they weren't as 100% on board with it as the more rural crowd was. They weren't 100% against it either. But it wasn't seen as the monstrous problem to them that it was to the rural community. Okay? And fueling a lot of this was anti-immigrants. Back to our Irish, the Irish Catholics. So we got a religious part of this. As you know, Catholics and the Protestants have been blowing each other up since time immemorial. Okay? Then you got the Chinese who are Buddhists, and they're hoo-hoo. Okay, so they saw them as something wrong with them too. Fill in the blank. Anybody that they found objectionable, they based it around alcohol in some way, shape, or form. Okay? So they managed to get their equally influential men to pass prohibition. December of 1917 would become what we call the 18th Amendment. Now, if I ask you a question, did the 18th Amendment make drinking, manufacturing, alcohol illegal? The answer is no. Amendments cannot make anything legal or illegal. They can prohibit, and keep this in mind, they can prohibit the manufacturing, the sale, the distribution of alcohol. The 18th Amendment said absolutely nothing about drinking. Did not say you could not drink, which was kind of an oddity, but that it just didn't. But it has no force in law. That would take the Volstead Act to put teeth in the 18th Amendment and actually provide a way to enforce it. And that's where we got the Prohibition Bureau. You see, that took almost a year. So they passed the 18th, and they can't do really a thing about it until they got the Volstead Act passed. And okay, off we go. And we have Prohibition. The idea was to eliminate alcohol out of American society. Needless to say, Americans liked their alcohol, and they were going to get it one way or another. And of course, out in the rural sticks, you could find all our lovely terms that we still have with us today as they made their stills. They made their own alcohol. You've heard the term bathtub gin. Anybody know where that term came from? They had cars at that time. They would take out the back seat and put in this huge enameled, claw-footed bathtub and fill it with gin to take it from one place to the other. Because there was no other way to carry a huge quantity, but that bathtub sure carried. If you've never been in a big old clawfoot bathtub, you can drown in the damn thing. It's huge. All right. And various other terms that we've had over the years, speakeasies, blind pigs, so on and so forth. But people were going to have their alcohol. And my dissertation was on the history of sheriffs, and this was something I had to deal with. Because how is a sheriff whose law in his county says that prohibition's in full effect, they can't drink, yet the very people who gave him that office and will continue to give him that office are running stills? How does he enforce it? He either goes against the very mandate of the oath he took as sheriff, which means that whatever term he's got is going to be his last, or he just kind of, what still? I didn't see a still. Did you see a still? I didn't see a still. So he ignores the other part of his oath to enforce the law. It was a huge problem for sheriffs. Police departments didn't have that issue. They didn't have that issue at all. But the sheriffs did. They had to grapple with this on a daily basis. And it ended up becoming what we call the most lawless period in American history because we have the start of organized crime. People were going to have their alcohol. And they had to put together a system, even for those rural stills, to get the alcohol to the people who wanted it. So our black market explodes. People are cheering on. That goes on to this day. People cheer when they watch the Bonnie and Clyde movies. Natural born killers. Cheer them on. Really? We're cheering on. Okay. And all of those big figures that we had for organized crime, the average person on the street, unless they got caught during one of those crossfires, cheered them on too. Refused to turn them in because they were providing booze at their speakeasy. So it made it enormously difficult for law enforcement. And what they put in that alcohol, just like modern day cutting of drugs, these guys would add anything liquid to that alcohol to expand the amount. Number one that most people have found is kerosene. Oh, that's a great stuff to be drinking. All right. Nowadays, we see them with wood alcohol. Grain alcohol and wood alcohol are not the same thing. Wood alcohol is very, very dangerous. 85% of the time it'll cause permanent blindness. Along with a whole host of other issues, but anyways. But God knows, just like they add now to drugs, you don't know what you're taking. They didn't know what they were drinking. And moonshine in and of itself, oh Lordy. When you get something that's 150 proof, you just kind of smell it. And, okay, I'm awake now. I need to drink it. So, yeah. Well, there was another problem that they hadn't thought of. Alcohol was taxed. Alcohol, given our propensity for drinking large quantities, produced a very nice, healthy income for the federal government. And then this lovely thing known as the Great Depression comes along. And the feds are going, oh shit, wait a minute, we need that money back. We need it now, quickly. So there was a very big kick in the butt for the 18th Amendment to be repealed, and it was. And the only way they could repeal it was by a new amendment, which of course is the 21st Amendment, that said alcohol was once again legal and taxable, so we can get our money back. It's something that has been a constant argument, because many people argue in the legalization of drugs or even decriminalization. Tax it. Tax it. Great source of income.
So we still have dry counties though, right?
Yes.
Because that's what I live in, dry county, so just.
I had never heard of such a thing coming from California. I was out here for a horse show, world championship. My horse won world title. I wanted to go get drunk. Okay? Come on, you want to celebrate. It also happened to be my birthday, so I was really going to celebrate this bad boy. And I go to the store and it goes, we can't sell it to you. I'm like, what? It's like noon. What do you mean you can't sell it to me? Blue laws, you cannot sell on Sunday. I had never heard of such. I was ready to steal it right out of the cooler. What do you mean you can't sell it to me? And then I learned the whole term of the dry county because we're frantically running around all over the place trying to find someplace.
It's like that liquor stores in town, you have to go across the.
Yes.
It goes across the river.
Yeah. Never heard of such a thing in my life.
I've never been to expect somebody.
Yeah, well, make it crazier. I couldn't buy it, but I could go to a restaurant and order a drink.
Yeah.
And like, you go to like Walmart and all of that and buy it after like 11.
Really?
Sunday. Or I think it's 10.
There's no liquor though.
Oh yeah, like
Walmart, yeah.
there's no liquor, but
That's okay. I can buy a case. I'll get there sooner or later. I may have to drink more, but I'll get there. Your first world time. I'm going to celebrate this. I'm going to celebrate this till I pass out. So I was not happy. Every year after that, when we hauled out here for big shows, we had a whole cooler that was filled with nothing but booze. Anyways, so Roosevelt repeals it. Alcohol is back in the game, and we're happily drinking away. Problem is that didn't get rid of organized crime. You know, once we open that door, there's no closing it. So after World War II, which ended when, guys? I realize it's ancient history to you guys. Thank you. 1945. Alcohol and tobacco is seen as being cool. Come on, Camel Cools. All right, all the cigarette ads. Virginia Slims had their ads for women. Okay, that it was just, you know, so suave and sophisticated to, you know, you didn't smoke Marlboros. Okay, but they even had brands that had special names that were marketed to women. Benson and Hedges was a woman's cigarette. No man would be caught dead with anything other than a Marlboro, a Camel, a Winston, you know, those manly cigarettes. Okay? And of course, women had, oh my God, they're still out there. They had these little smoking things where the cigarette went in the end so it would come out really long. And they would show the pictures of them holding these cigarette holder things.
little cigarette cases. They had intricate designs on it for the ladies. Anyways, but heroin, marijuana, of course, and cocaine are now considered on the bad side, which of course they have for the most part stayed, except for marijuana. But alcohol and tobacco were actually marketed. Kids could buy tobacco anywhere because we had tobacco vending machines. Put your quarter in, pull your lever for whatever flavor of the month you wanted. So anybody could get it, even though cigarettes were always over 18, but trying to get them under 18, you didn't even have to try. Right? Alcohol was a little harder, but not that hard. So eventually, they start adding more regulations, more penalties, increasing penalties for drugs that they start classifying as narcotics. And then, of course, marijuana. Remember, that's still the demon weed, the devil's lettuce. Look at the names that they use for this stuff. Okay, so they were seen as a gateway drug. Anybody who smoked a joint was destined to die an addict in Skid Row. That was the only thing that they saw it as. So they considered marijuana to be as bad, if not in some ways worse, than other drugs. So at first, we've got some pretty severe penalties. Okay, first-time offenders doing 2 years, 10 years for a second. That's kind of a big deal. It's absolutely a big deal. So we're flooding our prisons right off the get-go with drug offenders. And like I said, this is where our 2 guys get the death penalty for pot. Okay. Now, Furman, again, would take care of some of those death sentences, but remember, death penalty was reinstated 4 years later in 76. So, now us far out hippies, who were the coolest generation ever, just look at our clothes that we wore. Like peace, love, and the American way. We were good at social protest. We weren't sure why, because, we were usually so high when we were doing our protesting, but we protested. We were very good at it. There was more drugs going around those protests than you could shake a stick at. Vietnam, obviously, was a big one. It's not so much at the beginning. Not so much at the beginning. But as the war dragged on and on and on, and we have these young men coming back in pieces, or coming back in boxes, public opinion starts shifting away from supporting it to the point where it became very, very severe anti-war sentiment. And of course, there was a lot of, hey, it was the age of Aquarius, sexual revolution. Women were coming out of the kitchen, going into the workforce because they had to during World War II when all the men were gone. So women had gotten a taste of working and not just in typing pools. And they wanted to stay there. And we went from that 3-bedroom picket fence, mom at home for the kids baking cookies, to a whole different mindset. And of course, the old guard wasn't real thrilled with this idea, burn the bra, burn your underwear type thing that was going on at the time. But it got a lot of attention. It absolutely got a lot of attention. And of course, there was drug use. You look at those pictures, it's the most glorious of all events. Woodstock. You look at some of the pictures, and even in the most general of pictures, if you take the time to look, the amount of drugs and alcohol that was going around that concert was interesting. Okay, huge quantities. Because you weren't cool if you didn't at least smoke a joint. I mean, you didn't have to take acid trips, but, you could at least smoke a joint. Toke. It was called a toke. You had to toke a puff of marijuana. Anyways, it was flowing. And the adults, old guard, parents, were like, oh my God, the youth of society is doomed. Because we're all running around naked at a concert, toking on our marijuana joints, driving Herbie the Love Bug. You had to love the Volkswagen Bug. It was an awesome car. You had a lot of fun with those cars. Not to mention our love bug vans and other interesting terms for those vans of the day. You can fit a lot of people in there. And they were alarmed. They were alarmed. We had taken the norms, the social norms, and turned them upside down. Absolutely turned them upside down. Men were no longer interested in just going to work and coming home, making enough money to support the entire family. Women didn't want to stay home and do nothing but take care of the house and the kids. They wanted a job. And 2.3 kids was not necessarily required. That was the norm, 2.3 kids. Living in that nice little box next to another box, next to another box in that nice little cookie cutter neighborhood where all the women joined PTA and the guys went out and took care of the sports teams and so on. That was just the norm. That's what everybody did. What do you mean you don't want to do it? What's wrong with you? What's absolutely wrong with you? And even medical professionals, this is where women got so hooked on Valium and various other drugs because there had to be something wrong with these women who didn't want to have 2.3 kids and stay home and bake cookies. So here's some drugs to fix it. Librium, Valium, and so on, which are very addictive drugs, as you'll see when we get to the chapter on those drugs. Okay? So the whole kind of world social calendar was thrown up in the air, and everyone's standing around going, what the hell just happened? As everybody's trying to figure out which way to go. But drugs now are a white middle class problem. It's not the immigrants. It's not the people in the slums or the ghettos. Now it's in their backyard and at their PTA meetings and at their workplace. So it got everybody going like a bunch of deer caught in the headlights as they're trying to figure out now what to do. So out comes President Nixon, and he starts what is forever known as the war on drugs that we're still warring on. We haven't moved forward. I think if anything, we've moved backwards. But so, thanks to Nixon and his war on drugs, we have the first big one as far as legalities, and that is the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention and Control. Very simply, the CSA. That's what we call it, CSA. So now we have our 5 classification schedules. Okay, that's your whole assignment. Okay, what I'm looking for in there is what makes a class 1 drug different from a class 2, different from a class 3, and so on. Medical uses versus non-medical uses, addiction properties, so on and so forth. There's what they use to classify a drug as Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Now, for the assignment, how do we turn the assignment in
You
itself?
bring it here,
Bring it here.
paper copy in
Paper
class.
The 10th, right?
I don't remember. I got too many classes. I'm supposed to remember all the due dates?
Yeah.
No?
10th.
Okay, next Tuesday.
Gotcha.
Paper with your name on it, please. And make sure you put somewhere on there day, so it's not my night class. Okay. Your grade starts slipping if I got to search through figuring out which class you're in. It's annoying.
And it's just us listing there, or is it like
No.
MLA?
Read
Like
the
IPA?
rubric there.
Yeah, you
I want more than just class 1,
yeah.
through what makes it a drug to be put into class 1.
Mm-hmm.
What makes them put into class 2, and so on. And you're supposed to give me 2 examples, and I don't want just a name. Heroin is in 1. Yeah, okay, I know that. Be a little more expansive here, okay, when you give me an example. Okay. Anyways, so it gave us our classification schedules, which of course we use to this day. Nothing's changed. And now we have the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Neat group of guys. I interviewed for them. They're fun. One thing you have to keep in mind if you have a dream of working for the DEA is, I love this is why I said no, you have to sign a mobility waiver. You can be shifted anywhere in the continental United States on a 24-hour notice, and that can be a permanent change. So you're working out of Los Angeles, and all of a sudden you're shifted to Mino, South Dakota, and that's going to be your world for the next 5 years until they transfer you someplace else. They can't transfer you overseas without your permission. So within the U.S., yeah, you sign that mobility waiver. As soon as they handed me that bad boy, sorry, no, ain't doing it. Ain't doing it. I ain't bouncing around all over the country. But anyways, they are a great group of people. But they handle all drug enforcement type stuff. And they work a lot, obviously, with ATF. So obviously they were trying to figure out how to get the majority of our drugs which come in overseas. How? Well, first thing he tried didn't work well. They got into a pissing contest over this. Went to the president of Turkey and say that they were going to cut off all aid if you guys didn't stop all shipments. Well, Nixon, you haven't been able to stop the shipments. What makes you think he's going to be able to do it? Okay, it doesn't work that way. So they got in a major pissing contest over it. And this is where they started the eradication programs in Mexico, and it created a lot of heartache for a lot of poor farmers that saw their entire crops wiped out because what they would do is fly over them with crop dusting type planes, and they had basically oil-based, petroleum-based fluids in there to kill the crops. Problem is, did that stop the dealers from sending their drugs? No, you just ruined what little money that farmer had to feed his family. So it created a lot of resentment. And while I get the idea, eliminate the crops, I get it, but it didn't hit the intended target. It hurt a lot of people with no recourse. And he also did start the beginning of treatment programs. One big one out there, still in use to this day, is methadone programs. It's an opiate substitute. It gives them relief from the withdrawals without giving them a high. That's the idea behind it. The problem was they didn't realize when they first started it that methadone has its own addiction issues. Not as severe as heroin, but it definitely has addiction issues. So it's a problem in and of itself. But again, it was a start. It was recognizing that we have a need for treatment-based programs rather than just lock them up and throw away the key. And that's been our history of drug enforcement and treatment. Which way do we go? We have some years when it's lock them up and throw away the key. You have anything, you get locked up. Then we have the other ones, don't lock up anybody, but treat everybody. Well, we can't do it either one that way. We can't afford to lock them all up because we simply don't have enough bed space. So we're going to hang them from the ceiling. I mean, we just don't. So, and I don't think any of you guys want to pay a whole lot more taxes to build a whole lot more prisons. I'm not into that, thank you very much. Yet at the same time, treatment costs money too. And these guys fall off the wagons 172 times. Well, but maybe it's that 173rd that they make it. But that all costs money. So where do we take the money to pay for that? There's no easy answer. There's no easy answer. And countries have tried fully legalizing and even allowing supply, like syringes and needles and even clean drugs. Some argued that this was going to send use through the roof. Others said it was going to give a bunch of overdoses and they were all going to die. Neither of which happened. There wasn't an increase in addicts. There wasn't much of an increase in overdoses, but it didn't stop anything either. The Scandinavian countries tried it. There's something going on in Israel. I wish they'd quit worrying with somebody so I could go over there and find out. They have a rehab program in their prisons that has a 20% recidivism rate. 80% success. That's unheard of. That is absolutely unheard of. And when joking with a colleague, I was like, okay, you can't be executing them all and then claiming no recidivism. He said, no, we're not killing them. We're not killing them. I'm like, okay, I have got to find out what they're doing because that's a better recidivism rate than anyone in the world. Russian just executes them for the most part. Okay, well, you can claim less recidivism, but I don't think that's quite the route we're gonna be on. So what is it that they're doing? Love to know. Love to know. Not going over there right now. So I keep all my body parts attached to the part they're supposed to be. Thank you. Whew. Anyway, I'm gonna end it there. Out of time. Have a good